We still do 7 NUFC Matters show a week for free. But if you want to help support NUFC Matters, then there are a few ways of doing it. Hit the like button on each live broadcast and video. This helps the channel grow. Hit the subscribe button and select the all notifications bell so you don't miss a single show. If you want to help us financially, then you can join the channel using this button with the membership starting at $1.99 a month. Or you can drop us a donation in the chat using a super sticker. We're also looking for sponsors. If you'd like your brand advertised on the flyers for the show and featured during the ad break, then email John at nufcmatters.com to arrange today.
Talking to myself again, but it's the only way you're ever gonna learn. You look back and it's all in the past. I'm dwelling on the thoughts I cannot say to you. If I don't say the words, then maybe it's not true. And it feels alright when they come and say to you,
good evening, welcome to NUFC Matters with me, Steve Wraith. It is the transfer show with Ben Jacobs. Good evening, Ben.
Evening, Steve. How are you doing?
Very good, mate. Good to see you. And I'm going to get the elephant out of the room for our regular viewers. Stu Penman did offer you an opportunity to go into a bet. You decided it was against. Well, it's not a good idea. It's not a good look for a journalist to take a bet like that. However, you are quite keen to do a bet with regards to Newcastle and Leicester and where they might finish. Who might finish the highest in the Premier League? I don't want you to say anything, Ben. I don't want you to get involved in it. We've asked the question. The answer was no to that betting question. We'll move on. So that stops anybody asking before we start, because tonight is about transfers. We want to know Ben's insight on some of the deals that may or may not happen, some of the rumours. Can he squash any of them? That's where we're coming to tonight. And as always, we're broadcasting across Facebook, LinkedIn, and on X, as well as on YouTube. So if you're watching on any of those platforms tonight, please open YouTube at some point tonight, search NUFC Matters, and hit the subscribe button. We do 7 shows a week, and it is all free of charge. Okay, Ben, I'm going to start with another elephant in the room. Barry Hogan and Tom Dixon asking quite early about the story that Craig Hope has brought in the Daily Mail. Is there anything in Chelsea making an enquiry for Newcastle striker Alexander Isak?
Yeah, I think the first thing to say is that Newcastle's position on Isak is that he's untouchable or as good as, barring an astronomical offer. So there's the possibility of Isak agreeing a new deal at Newcastle, although nothing is advanced. But when you're talking about that, it's kind of normal to create a little bit of leverage. And quite clearly, there's plenty of clubs that want Alexander Isak in an ideal world, but it's about whether Newcastle are prepared to sell. And I'd be very surprised if this one progresses. I think from Chelsea's point of view, they are looking for value in the market and not to break their wage structure. And to get Isak, they'd have to pay miles above the odds, and they'd have to make him one of the best paid players at the club. So the Chelsea position, to my knowledge, is the same as the Arsenal one, that they appreciate Isak from afar, but they're not anticipating a realistic opportunity in the market, and therefore Isak is highly likely to stay at Newcastle United. It remains to be seen whether he signs a new deal. I think that it makes a big difference to him in the long term, not necessarily next season, but if Newcastle don't get back into European football, then in the distant future, there's more of a chance that maybe the player starts asking to go elsewhere. But for now, it'd be highly detrimental to Newcastle's project to entertain any kind of offers. It's different with Bruno Guimaraes because there was a release clause that has now expired, and then there may well be an offer beneath that release clause that comes between now and the end of the window, and Newcastle may decide that it's worth losing one key asset, depending on their financial situation. And remember, the 30th of June deadline is not as hard as people think it is. If you can show that you were close to a deal in and around, then if you go into July and a deal still gets done, then you have the ability to claim it as what's called a near miss and therefore still put it on this financial year. So Guimaraes is a different kind of proposition because Manchester City in particular still could come and make a very substantial bid. But with Isak, I think that Newcastle want to just flat reject offers because they know they might lose Callum Wilson as well. And obviously if Isak and his goals were to be taken away from the team, it's a whole lot harder to keep the project going and move in the right direction. So Newcastle are under no pressure to sell Isak. There's other ways that they can get to the money they need to satisfy PSR, but still they do need that one big outgoing, and it's not yet happened. We wait and see whether Minter gets over the line somewhere, and that may be a means of raising some capital. Callum Wilson could depart. It's not unthinkable another offer comes in for Kieran Trippier. You've got players potentially like Lascelles or Longstaff. Elliot Anderson was offered in a swap deal for Max Kilman. Miguel Almiron is on the market as well for somewhere in the region of 20 to 25 millions. There's lots of ways that Newcastle can get the money they need to satisfy PSR. And I still suspect, having asked again to sources, that Isak will not be the route that they go in order to sell, satisfy PSR and bring in money. And if that changes, it will be one of the shocks of the window.
Let's give Newcastle fans more positive vibes whilst they're tuning in their numbers tonight. Over 1,400 watching live. So big thanks to everyone who's tuned in. Talk of potentially a new contract for Isak at Newcastle. Is there anything similar in a way on that? Because, you know, obviously he's proved his worth already in the Premier League for Newcastle. He's certainly going to be a world-class striker if he's not already. Is there a chance that Newcastle might seize this moment to offer an improved deal to keep him at the club?
Well, I think they're going to have to offer him an improved deal at some point. It's always difficult when the window is open. And that's the part where, from a player's point of view, you get a little bit of leverage because there can be speculation. There might well be inquiries. Somebody may try their luck with Newcastle to try and capitalise on the financial situation. That's what makes it slightly nerve-wracking, but also exciting if you're a neutral as we head to this financial deadline. It's not normal that we'd be talking about a financial deadline being exciting, but it creates a deadline within the window, miles away from deadline day, that is also highly significant. And that may well result in people saying, let's test Newcastle's resolve, because nobody knows the books at Newcastle, at Everton, at Villa, at Chelsea, at Nottingham Forest, whether these clubs have problems or not. Some are reported in the media, some are denied by the clubs. But if you're a suitor, you may go to those clubs and simply try your luck and see whether at the end of the day, approaching the 30th of June, they're handcuffed in any way. So don't be surprised if we see some movement out of opportunism, but obviously the club is in a very well protected position with Isak. And a new deal is not advanced. It's not something that is definitively going to happen, but we know in an ideal world for Newcastle, that's what they'd want. And if you're Isak, you would use the speculation as leverage and allow the window to drag on. And then if he wishes to stay, try and get better terms out of it. And remember, better terms will not necessarily only be financial. Better terms could be a release clause as well, like with Bruno Guimaraes, so he can have his cake and eat it. Maybe there's a verbal agreement, even if it's not on paper, that allows him to go if Newcastle go back-to-back seasons without getting European football, like I referenced earlier. So I think this isn't only about Newcastle trying to secure Isak. This would also be about the player putting in some kind of protection mechanism, not because he's not happy at Newcastle United. It's the right place for him and his career, and he's scoring a lot of goals. He was very close ultimately to winning the Golden Boot. But still, when that happens, the player starts to think, could I earn more money? Could I go and play Champions League football? And if he signs a new deal, he'll want that element of protection potentially. And it's a new sort of territory for Newcastle to be in. And it's harder, of course, because at the moment, Dan Ashworth is on gardening leave and they still don't have a new sporting director in. So there's a lot of pressure on Darren Eales and Amanda Staveley and others at the club, including Eddie Howe, to work collaboratively to fill that kind of void, because Ashworth isn't involved in any way. He's not using his gardening leave to help the club. They're not on good terms. There's legal action being taken place. And the crossroads Newcastle are at is they've always been against release clauses. They've always been against gentlemen's agreements. They've never really broken their wage structure to play in a top six field financially. And sometimes to do that, you have to say to that one player, you can earn significantly more than all of the others at the club. And Newcastle have always been much more stringent because they realise until they get sustained Champions League football, they have to be relatively careful, financially speaking. And if they are to push out the boat for Isak, how does that reflect with other players at the club, and does it set a bad precedent? So it's quite interesting because they did cave to the Bruno Guimaraes release clause, but a number the club felt wasn't market value was above it and would put suitors off. And that's proven to be the case because that release clause came and went. So now we wait and see whether that has a domino effect. And the next player that wants to renew says, yes, I'll renew because I love it at Newcastle, but with the caveat of X or Y, which is either a formal release clause or a big increase in wages that makes him the highest earner at the football club, or a gentleman's agreement to ultimately depart if Newcastle don't get European football. And these type of conversations take time and are not always best had when the window is open and without a sporting director in place. And that's why I think we're going to have to wait regarding Isak and any new deal a little bit longer. But Isak signing a new deal or not signing a new deal is kind of irrelevant to the point of, will Newcastle sell Isak now or not? And I come back to what I said before. It's going to take an astronomical offer, potentially a Premier League record, to even make Newcastle consider selling Alexander Isak. They see him as untouchable. They'd rather, and I'm not saying they want to lose any of these players, but they'd rather lose Bruno first, not Isak. They'd rather lose 3 or 4 other players to get to that 40 to 100 million, depending on how much they need in the market, not just for PSR, but to move and sign other players. They'd rather lose a whole combination of other players other than Isak. Because if you take Isak away, it's a step back for the project. And then you've got to go and find a 20-plus goal scorer in the Premier League, and maybe not being able to spend all of that Isak money to do so. So it's much better just to say we invest in the player we've got. He's right for the project. We might lose Callum Wilson anyway. We need to keep those 20 goals, because if you pull away those 20 goals, then Newcastle suddenly might fear that however much they are united and moving in the right direction under Eddie Howe could set the project back. And it's already been set back by Manchester United winning the FA Cup and Newcastle not having European football. So I think there'll be real pushback at Newcastle's end about selling Isak. And I don't think that that saga has anything directly linked to a new contract. I think it's just the leverage of any speculation will put Isak in a stronger position when they get a little bit closer to having that conversation about extending.
Yeah, I know. One of the people in the chat there said keep your answers limited to 10 minutes, but you've covered a lot of ground there, mate, and there's a lot of conversation that the people want to talk about. 2,100 watching. A hell of a lot of interest tonight, Ben, in this particular show, because you're on. You're a big part of nufc matters. It's always good to get your feedback, and I've always got to stress when we get journalists on here that it's their opinion. And Ben does get stories from a lot of different sources. We get information, as you know, on this channel as well, but we don't. We always steer clear of speculation, and I just want to say that we do give our opinion. It's our opinion only. Some things might come true, others things might not, but we never want to lead anybody up the garden path on nufc matters. Steve on X this afternoon, he said, who other than DCL, Dominic Calvert-Lewin, of course, are our striker targets, would you say?
Yeah, I think Dominic Calvert-Lewin has hit a hitch, and part of that is that Minter seemingly has other places that he would like to be. There's no agreement with Lyon at this point. There's Roma who are interested as well. So that could be a big one for Newcastle. I think some Newcastle fans might be disappointed to see him go. Maybe the blow would have been softened if Dominic Calvert-Lewin had gone the other way. But that swap deal, if we can call it, is off for now, to my understanding. And I think the correct term is mirror deal, I was told by someone at UEFA. In other words, 2 concurrent deals, totally separate. And the advantage is obviously that you can put each of the deals on your book as profit regarding the player that departs, and then you can amortize the one that you bring in over the contract length. So the one you buy is a small outlay, and by the time you get 1-2 years in, the financial rules will have changed, and then the one that you ultimately sell goes straight onto your books, in many cases as pure profit. And that means that PSR concerns can be alleviated, so the clubs can work together. And we've seen that with a few deals, Villa dealing with Everton, Villa dealing with Chelsea, but it's not to be for Newcastle and Everton. So that one is still potentially a live wire with Dominic Calvert-Lewin, because he's got more than one destination where he might go. And if Everton don't sell Jared Branthwaite, then it's very likely that Dominic Calvert-Lewin is the big outlay that they're thinking of selling in order to be sure to balance the books. The other thing, though, as well, that put Everton in a stronger position is just that Dan Friedkin, who is also the Roma owner, is in the process of exclusivity and has already injected 200 million into the club. So that helps Everton also feel that they've got no imminent debt to pay off and that they're less worried about their financial sustainability. So therefore, they may not need to lose as many of their big names. I think away from Dominic Calvert-Lewin, there's a few names to consider for Newcastle United still. One we can take off the table, but they were looking into it, and that's Sergio Guirassy. I think we spoke about this 2 or 3 months ago. The expectation is that he's off to Dortmund, and Newcastle have known this for quite some time. So I'm not convinced that Newcastle ever thought that they stood a chance with Guirassy in the last month or so. But if we kind of go back to after the January window, they were very seriously looking at that as one possibility. I think that the other names that Newcastle have looked at have not been out and out strikers. They've more been wingers or creative minded players. We know that they were in formal conversations with Crystal Palace looking at Michael Olise, but he's off to Bayern. Crescencio Somerville could still be a possibility for Newcastle. Liverpool have backed off that one for now, to my knowledge, and Chelsea could still be a possibility there. And Brighton are the other club to watch, not an out-and-out attacker, of course, but would chip in with a fair amount of goals. And remember, the other thing at Newcastle is that you got Anthony Gordon, who can play wide or central and really relishes playing central. So there is a possibility, if Isak is rested or Gordon on form prefers to play more centrally, that he moves there. And then any wide player that comes in joins the front line in that 4-3-3. And this is why I think Eddie Howe is going to be quite flexible with the attack-minded targets that he is looking at. And beyond that, not much else really to bring you. Unfortunately, there was no truth in the Dominic Solanke links, even though Eddie Howe really likes the player. And that 65 million release clause is well out of Newcastle United's budget. There's nothing in some talk, I think it was more a few months ago than now, that Ivan Toney is on Newcastle's radar. But one name to maybe keep an eye on, and whether or not Fulham would sell, I doubt it at this point. But if they could bring in some money and get another striker, which is the priority, then Rodrigo Muniz is one to watch. And Newcastle perhaps would have been in a stronger position if they had, again, European football, because the player just may not want to leave London at this point. He finished the season on a scoring streak, not desperate to leave at this point. But there was sort of a brief period where Fulham had Broja on loan. They were looking to add to their attacking line. And at that point, Muniz wasn't in great form. And he hit a purple patch at exactly the right time. So momentum and being settled would probably suggest that the player wouldn't be desperate for a move, but just keep half an eye on that one, because Newcastle like the player, they like the profile, and it may be at the right number that a suitor will be able to come in there. Chelsea had a conversation as well, but haven't advanced. So all of these names have one thing in common, right? Proven Premier League. It means that Newcastle, in terms of their striker options, are not necessarily looking too far outside of the Premier League. They want somebody that they can drop in. They want somebody that maybe is tall, big, physical, can complement the wide players around. They want someone that's maybe prepared to be a squad player, knowing that Isak is going to be the main central striker. And they want that kind of young profile that can grow and develop at the club. And those kind of names are not really around for under 35 million. So I still sense if Newcastle move in this direction, they either need to line up a deal like they did with Everton, where they bring in a big name, but someone goes the other way, or alternatively, they need to sell first to generate the funds and then move in the market around that 35 million mark. I've heard links with Broja and Newcastle as well. My understanding is still that's an Everton or potentially Wolves or Milan deal. And if Manchester United get Joshua Zirkzee, then there's a realistic possibility that Milan put all of their energy and efforts into trying to sign Broja instead. And they've already held some meetings in London. So there's a merry-go-round of movement at the moment. And I think from Newcastle United's point of view, the priority is not going to be who are they going to sign. It's going to be how can they satisfy PSR, get beyond the 30th of June. And then at that point, we'll start to see some of this talk around the incomings pick up a bit more.
Interesting that you mentioned the the English connection with Newcastle. A lot of people saying, is that where we're focused, Ben? Is that what Newcastle are doing? Are they not looking abroad? Are they not scouting abroad? Or has that got something to do with the people who are actually in charge of our transfer, dealings? Because we haven't got a sporting director, or are we missing out because of that?
No, I don't think so. My understanding is just that you got Eddie Howe, who's always had a big say, and he likes to look a little bit closer to home. But by the same token, it's a big operation, and eventually it's expected to be multi-club. It's going to be very interesting to see what develops with Monaco and a Saudi-led group, even though my understanding is that's not PIF. We can go into that a little bit later. But if the Saudis buy 67% of Monaco, then you potentially have some kind of indirect connection between Newcastle and a French club, plus the PIF ones in Saudi Arabia. And as the multi-club network grows, whether it's official or whether it's kind of indirect, you might see Newcastle start to think about more of a group head or someone with big European experience. And this is why somebody like Johannes Spoors was considered and is still believed to be one of the final candidates in the race for the Newcastle sporting director, because he's been a group head, he's got experience at multiple clubs, he's got a good eye for talent. And therefore, I think when we look at Newcastle and their work under Dan Ashworth and their scouting, it will require something that maybe has a bit of a bigger picture strategically. And that may come, as I say, if Newcastle ever add a club like Chelsea have done, like Manchester United ultimately have done with Ratcliffe coming in. And I don't think we can say that Newcastle at the moment are only looking in the Premier League. I just think that the hole they're looking to fill, whether they publicly admit it or not, is a Callum Wilson replacement. So you either go experienced and bring in someone a bit older that can play within the squad along with Isak, or you just bring in a younger striker that has longevity at the football club, but again, comes from the Premier League, because they want someone they can drop straight in, a player for the now that hopefully can guarantee you 10, 15, maybe even 20 goals, because that's the difference between Newcastle fighting for Champions League or not having any kind of European football. But if you look back a bit more broadly at Newcastle's signings, Sven Botman wasn't from the Premier League, Bruno Guimaraes wasn't from the Premier League, Joe Linton wasn't from the Premier League, and these are all core signings. Even Kieran Trippier, I know, clearly had played in England, but came from Atleti. So Newcastle are looking across all parts of Europe. It's not like they've only got a history of signing from the Premier League, but there's just that opportunism at this part of the window. A few quality, experienced Premier League players are available on the market. They tried for Tosin. They've brought in Lloyd Kelly. Clearly in that striker position, they're also looking for proven Premier League quality. And I don't think that's down to a lack of depth in the scouting. I think that's just being driven through conversations between Darren Eales at the moment, who is involved, and Eddie Howe, who's always had an element of autonomy. And he feels that Newcastle need depth and Newcastle need reliable players that maybe are not going to take 1-2 years to bed in, because there's almost perverse pressure. Like if Newcastle hadn't got Champions League in that first season and had finished 10th, and then last season had finished in a European place but been knocked out by Manchester United, then people would probably say, if we can keep the squad together, we could finish 5th or 6th and it would be progress. But because they've gone Champions League, no European football, if then they end up with no European football again next season, the fan base might start saying the recruitment's wrong, we lost Ashworth, Howe's the wrong man for the job. And that is just the perversity of the fact that the ownership group tried to set a strategy of 3 to 5 years of getting Newcastle out of trouble, of stabilising, of getting into European football. But because they got Champions League so quickly, the bar's gone higher. And now there's scrutiny over everything they do, when actually I think the bones of the club are in a good place. The ambition, the scouting network, the camaraderie, the talent ID, the tactics, the manager, it's all there. It just takes a little bit of time for the infrastructure and the finances to catch up. And that's why Newcastle are at a slight disadvantage compared to the big six.
Yeah. Truth says you should do audiobooks, Ben. You can talk for hours. It's a joke, though. Yes, there's Truth.
I've done audiobooks before, in fact.
Good stuff. Okay, we've got 3,000 watching, Ben. I think it's a testament to how much people enjoy listening to you talk about transfers, potential transfers, trying to essentially make sense of what is going to happen at Newcastle. And before we go to the break, I just want to ask you about Trafford, because he was a name that came in early, the goalkeeper, of course, at Burnley. And Newcastle bid for him, but it was short of what Burnley were expecting. Where are we on that? Are we still expecting Newcastle will push forward with that one over the course of the next week or so?
Who was that, Steve? Sorry, you cut out.
Trafford from Burnley.
Yeah, I think so. The problem from the Burnley perspective with the Newcastle bid, which was in the region of 16 million, it was not just the number, and it may not seem that far off the 20 odd million that Burnley won. It was also the structure of the deal, and it was too add-on heavy. So there's still some negotiation to be done. I think Newcastle don't fear anymore, like maybe they did a few weeks ago, a Chelsea hijack at this point. Enzo Maresca is going to judge his goalkeepers first and then decide if they need another one, but that's not done yet. And obviously the other thing in all of this is if Newcastle just delay that negotiation in terms of trying to get it over the line, then they can push it into July and they can put it on the next financial year. We're at the point now, by the way, where buyer and seller can declare the transfer fee on different years because the deal starts before the financial cutoff, and it can be done or it can be dated on the 1st of July. And that's what I mean about the near miss and the flexibility. So Burnley can do one thing, one financial year, Newcastle can do another, but it's a bit harder for Newcastle to do that if they've made an upfront payment, say 3 weeks before the accounting deadline. And I think that's led to a little bit of limbo, whereas I would still expect Newcastle to return and try and get that deal over the line. There remains optimism. There's been no other offer at the time we're recording for Trafford. Let's wait and see if that changes, because I think compared to other goalkeepers on the market, 20 million is a relatively value-light number. And there is a chance to take advantage of the fact that Burnley have gone down. So Newcastle are always just a little bit wary on that front, but they're not far off in terms of package as things stand. But it's not just about package, it's structure as well. And within that 16 million, Burnley want more up front and better payment terms with less add-ons. Whereas I think Newcastle feel like they can get to 18 million. They still want to go under 20 million, but around 18 million and just rejig a few things, and maybe also take advantage of the fact that Burnley need an injection of cash because they've gone down in order to comply with the financial rules as well. So we're not there yet with Trafford. It's not a done deal, but Newcastle do remain optimistic.
Okay, we'll have a 2-minute break. We'll be back after this.
A big thanks to all our sponsors. Skips and Bins. You can find their website at skipsandbins.com. Contact us, www.skipsandbins.com/contact. Say hello to low-cost waste disposal with pay-as-you-go and contract waste management. A big thanks to Mr. Vicky's Sauces, handmade in Cumbria. Their website, mrvickys.co.uk. Email info@mrvickys.co.uk. Telephone 01768 210 102. Thanks to United Group Travel. They are the Travel and Tourism Award winners in 2024. Their website, www.unitedgrouptravel.com. Email beverly.ugtl@gmail.com or telephone 01670 632 460 or mobile 0791 666 4174. Just £30 per person deposit. There are no strangers on our tours, just friends you haven't met yet. A big thanks to Media Arts. You can find them at www.media-arts.co.uk. And don't forget, we are a podcast. You can find us on iTunes or Spotify or other podcast providers. If you want to help the channel grow, then hit the like button, the little thumb underneath the video. Click share and share to your social media, or join the channel for as little as $1.99 a month. If you want to take out a one-off payment membership, go to nufcmatters.com and hit membership. And for a £25 fee, you get a scarf, a cup, a pen, and a membership card. You can also put a smartphone over the top of this QR code. It'll take you straight there. And don't forget, we also help the food bank on this channel. nufcfansfoodbank.co.uk is a website where you can make a virtual donation today.
And a couple of events coming up in the season due. 20th of July, Supermac and Gibbo and George and the Long Sands all on stage in aid of Dementia Matters. Tickets at tenner, nufcmatters.com, newcastlelegends.com, Tyneside Irish Centre, the venue for that event. Gibbo and Rob Lee are at Gateshead Leisure Centre on the 2nd of August. Tickets for that event are from gatesheadleisurecentre.co.uk. And a couple for your diary for next year. This one, An Evening with the Entertainers, features 15 of the entertainers: Beresford, Howie, Watson, Scott, Tommy Wright, Sellers, Fox, Beardsley, Robley, Gillespie, O'Brien, Pearson, Bracewell, Lee Clark and Brian Kilcline will all be at the Tyne Theatre and Opera House, and you can get your tickets from them at the box office 0844 249 1000. And last but by no means least, Peter Beardsley, 10th of the 1st as well, next year, is at the Tyneside Irish Centre. Tickets for that available from newcastlelegends.com, priced at £30 and £60. So lots of events coming up. And I've been asked by Danny Mitchell to give this one a plug for Dean Fox MND Foundation. This is a talk in with Martin Johnson, and that's coming up in the summer, the 12th of July, at the Crown Plaza. And if you want tickets to meet Martin Johnson, a rugby legend, 21st anniversary World Cup dinner, you can get your tickets from 0781 7412 524. Just give Danny Mitchell a call. Okay, lots to talk about on the transfer front today, and huge numbers tonight. 3,400 of you watching live. Facebook, LinkedIn, and X. If you're watching on there, please take the time to open another window on your computer. Go to YouTube, search nufc matters, and hit the subscribe button. It does do us a big favour. Okay, I'll take a couple of questions from people in the chat. I did highlight a couple of those. Benny asked, has Minte rejected Leon? Hearing it's between them and Marseille, although he wants to go to Everton, who want to pay peanuts. Yeah, the Minte one's interesting. And I guess I'll add something on at the end of that. Do Newcastle need to sell this player before the end of this month, Ben?
Not necessarily that player, but as I've said many times before, my understanding is to satisfy PSR, Newcastle need 30 to 50 million, and a Minter-shaped fee would certainly satisfy that. But there's other ways they can get there. And again, it's not like you hit midnight on the day of the deadline and then you're screwed. If you can show that you started negotiations, if you can show that you're in the process of generating a deal sheet, if you can show anything was advanced, you've basically got a grace period of a couple of weeks. So the 30th of June deadline, and Minter specifically, should not be seen as all or nothing as far as Newcastle are concerned. The Everton move was of appeal, and he was offered a fair amount of guarantees in terms of his involvement and minutes. And I'm also told that Roma is still another one to watch as well, which is quite interesting in many ways, because was he to go to Roma, then when Dan Friedkin comes in, it will be the same multi-club model, and therefore one of the clubs will have got the player over the other club. So let's just wait and see how that develops. At the moment, I'm told that Minter is quite a meticulous decision maker and is not going to be rushed into anything or forced into anything. So that's the thing to look out for. A Newcastle putting pressure to try and get an outgoing, which would play into the fact that they want that one to be the one that satisfies their books, or a Newcastle going to give him time to decide. And if they do, then it may run on into July, and that may suggest that Newcastle are either going to wait and call it a near miss and still try and put it on the books, or they'll turn their attention to bring in money elsewhere. And as I said before, this is just the reality of this part of the window and what makes the financial deadline so intriguing, because another club, such as a Isak suitor, may say, okay, we're going to take the gamble on the fact they needed that money. They haven't got that money. We're going to lowball them at 60, 65 million for Isak. It would normally be laughed out the room, but take it or leave it. And is that the difference between Newcastle getting a points deduction or not? And this is where it's kind of exciting but disappointing. The excitement is in the fact we're going to get a really busy week. We're going to get a lot of people trying their luck and testing the resolve of a club's finances that they won't know the ins and outs of. And the disappointment is the fact that the rules have put us in this position. And so many Premier League clubs are in a weakened position at this stage that one or two might be forced into sales. And that's disappointing. And that's ultimately why the clubs want the financial rules changed, even though we should stress they voted for them in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a merry-go-round of rules and regs, which all, as we've discussed on this programme, seem to be designed to stop Newcastle and other teams threatening the big six. A lot of people asking about Chelsea, Ben, in the chat, and how on earth are Chelsea getting away with this situation where they can continually spend money? Almost seems that it's one rule for them and one rule for everybody else. Another question as well, we can widen it a little bit. Craig saying, why is no one challenging Ratcliffe's narrative of not knowing about garden leave, tapping up Ashworth, etc.? Why does he free rein to have a go at Newcastle in the press with no pushback? I mean, there is a bit of this kind of us against them mentality amongst Newcastle fans, and I think you can see why, Ben.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll come on to Radcliffe in a moment. On the Chelsea front, I said I'd answer this in the chat, I think a few weeks ago, and someone was asking me on Twitter as well. You just got to appreciate their different models. And this is what I mean when I say Newcastle are at a disadvantage at the moment compared to the big six. And that won't change unless they get consistent European football so they can budget for that. And they might have to build a multi-club model. So Chelsea are spending more, but they've also got more assets. And when people presume that somehow Chelsea are doing something covert or cheating, the reality is they're making the same financial declarations as everybody else. And as of the last financial year, so not the cycle ending 23-24, which is about to be declared, but as of the previous financial year, in that 3-year cycle, they've declared like everyone else, and they're well within the rules. So the key thing now is, are they still going to be okay within the allowable 105 million losses at the end of this financial year off the back of a season where they didn't have any European football? And we wait and see whether two things happen. One, there's a flurry more outgoings at Chelsea now, because Chelsea sources have always indicated that they're more concerned with 24-25, not 23-24 as a financial year. And in addition to that, too, do we finally get clarity on the sale of 2 hotels by Chelsea? And is the number, which was just over 75 million that Chelsea declared, fair market value? And if it isn't, and it's a lower number, then that may mean that their finances up to the cycle ending 23-24 take more of a financial hit. But remember, Chelsea have got a lot of things that Newcastle have not got. They've got a seasoned academy that's always had a long-standing habit of generating profit. They've got lots of assets for sale. Like we've just seen Ian Matson go for 37.5 million. They've got Lukaku, they've got Broja. If they want, they've got Chalobah, potentially Gallagher, maybe David Datro Fofana, even though he's relatively new. They got lots and lots of assets that they can sell for, I would say, between 20 and 60 million. Whereas Newcastle have got a Bruno Guimaraes, whose release clause has now expired, and an Isak that they don't want to sell. But it's very difficult to find that many other players that might be available in the Newcastle squad that are going to bring you in 35 million plus. And in many cases at Chelsea, that's pure profit. And it isn't at Newcastle. I think Almiron might get you 20, 25 million. Callum Wilson, 15 to 20 million. If you don't want to sell Sven Botman, you're left with your Lascelles', your Longstaffs, your Trippiers. None of these players, either because of their age or time left on the contract or market value, in excess, in my view anyway, of 35 million. Whereas Chelsea have got 6 or 7 of them. And on top of that, in the previous summer, they also made a bunch of sales like Edouard Mendy and Kalidou Koulibaly to Saudi Arabia. So you can't really compare the two. And it's not a criticism of Newcastle. It's just Chelsea's model, by being big six for so long, is more developed in academy, in sales, in young players that are on long-term contracts that they can bring in big fees for. And this is why Chelsea are calm about the situation. Then in addition to that, you've got the grey area where Chelsea's parent company can buy assets like hotels, maybe even parts of Cobham, maybe car parks, and they can sell them from Chelsea Holding to the parent company. And under PSR, it's a bit different. Under UEFA, they can get away with that if they need, and they can generate funds. So Newcastle are up against someone like Chelsea. It's the same for Manchester City, where it's a club against a model, and it's a developed academy against one that doesn't yet have as much of a track record as generating that much money. And then because of that academy, the players that have come through that are still at Chelsea have got higher market values comparative to Newcastle. So this isn't a sort of big conspiracy. This is just down to the fact that Chelsea declare like everyone else, but they can bring in a lot more revenue at the moment than Newcastle. And in years where they've had consistent Champions League football and big sponsorship deals, that all helps as well. So Chelsea's finances are certainly in a more precarious position now than they were perhaps under the real glory years under Roman Abramovich and before the sanctions. But ultimately, they are just in a position where it's a bigger brand than Newcastle. It's a more lucrative academy than Newcastle. And you've got that sort of safety net, which gives you creative opportunities financially within the multi-club model, because the parent group and Chelsea Holdings can work together. And that just allows Chelsea a little bit more leeway and creativity. And sometimes the things they do, Newcastle United fans may not like. They may feel that they bend the rules. They may feel that they're too creative. But these are loopholes. And what you find is when the loophole is legal but contentious, eventually it gets closed, such as Chelsea amortising beyond 5 years. UEFA didn't like it. They said it's a maximum of 5 years. But Chelsea realised the opportunity. They did it when it was legal. And all the deals like Enzo Fernandez and Mykhailo Mudryk are amortised over longer periods of time than 5 years, which means that the annual transfer fees on the books are a little bit smaller. And that helps them as well. Regarding Ratcliffe, I think the reality of the situation is he's talking a lot, which is both refreshing, but it opens the door to more scrutiny and criticism. I noticed the other day he said to Bloomberg, and I'm sure he would argue that it was off the cuff words and he didn't mean it in this light, but Ratcliffe basically said that there's no real plan formulated yet for the women's team. His focus is on the first team. And of course you think, hang on a minute, the women's team is your first team. The men's team is your first team as well. And sometimes I think when he speaks, the words are not as thought out. And maybe that's the same for the gardening leave as well regarding Ashworth. But ultimately, whatever he says is not as relevant as Newcastle's position. And there's two things that Newcastle are using. One is that they haven't yet appointed a new sporting director, and I don't think they'll allow the impasse to be broken until they do. Two is the fact that Ashworth is taking legal action to try and force the issue and claim in many ways that he was sacked from the football club. And I think Newcastle feel confident that that's not the case. Three is, to my knowledge, the club is still paying Ashworth for gardening leave in a monthly salary, which also backs up the fact that he hasn't been sacked. And unless Ashworth declines that money and returns it, then Newcastle will just say they're within the terms of the gardening leave. And four is the fact that when they signed Ashworth, they protected themselves against this kind of exit. And they made sure that the gardening leave was lengthy and it was going to be very difficult for a rival to poach Ashworth. So Ratcliffe is speaking, in my opinion, more as somebody that doesn't want to mess around and feels like when he appointed Omar Barada from Manchester City, he was able to do that quickly with their biggest rival in Manchester, and it was smooth and it was amicable, and he doesn't understand why Newcastle are being so difficult. But Newcastle's position is they can be as difficult as they like because they're protected contractually. The gardening leave is the gardening leave. They don't yet have a replacement. So you either pay up or ultimately you have to abide by the terms of that gardening leave. So Newcastle are in a really strong position, and either arbitration will weaken their position, or alternatively arbitration is just a power play that's there to try and exert pressure. And I think it's the latter because Manchester United are funding that rather than Ashworth directly. And my sense is basically that when Newcastle get a new sporting director, and when it's clear that there's not a window of opportunity for Ashworth to start at Manchester United this summer, it will all become a lot more amicable. The arbitration will go away and they'll find a suitable compensation figure that won't be 2 million and won't be 20 million, but will be somewhere in the middle. I think on the lower side of 10 million might be something that Newcastle do to allow Ashworth to start in 2025 and not miss 2 windows and maybe 3, remember, because you can't really impact the summer window if you're not starting until kind of March or April 2025. So I still expect a compromise to be reached, but ultimately I don't think Newcastle care what Ratcliffe says in public. I think they just point to the contractual gardening leave. They point to the terms of exit. They point to what they believe to be an unsatisfactory compensation. And now they wait for their own new sporting director. But remember just one other thing, which is really key in all of this. And I know this is a very long answer, but I plead the fact that I was given 2 long and complicated questions for spending half the podcast on these 2 things. But just remember one last point, which is most of Newcastle's candidates for sporting director have been incumbents. Dougie Freeman at Palace, Johan Spors at 777. And there's another big name, by the way, that hasn't been reported that has a Newcastle connection and was interviewed at a big club in Europe. And although, to my knowledge, hasn't advanced, would also have been very difficult to get out of that contract. So there's a fair chance that Newcastle are going to have to pay compensation to get their new sporting director. And you would have thought that they would want to pay what it takes to get that sporting director to start as soon as possible, because right now they don't have anybody formally running the show. So if Newcastle pay compensation and this 20 million number is out there, if you're 777 with financial difficulties, there's a high likelihood that you say, okay, we'll have 20 million because that's the number that you put on Ashworth's head. So eventually, Newcastle are either going to have to overpay for a sporting director, potentially, to get them as soon as possible. And then maybe Manchester United see a valuation yardstick and match that. And both the numbers are high, but again, nowhere near 20 million. Or Newcastle are going to cut a deal a lot lower for compensation. And then ultimately, Manchester United are going to turn around and say, well, if you paid X for that guy, then we think with equivalent gardening leave, we should be able to pay the same number. And again, it gets resolved. So I still think that the formalisation of Ashworth to Manchester United, and it is a matter of when, not if, will come when Newcastle finally formalise, inclusive of compensation, their new sporting director.
Okay, we've got a couple of messages about players. Where is it? Yeah, the one on the screen, first of all, from Matty. Evening, lads. Might be a bit late. Do we have an interest in Nico Williams and Tikafusa Kubo?
Not really aware on Kubo, so I can answer that one for once in just a few seconds. I can look into that one for you, but I've not been told any significant links with Nico Williams. The problem is the package. I think Newcastle are going to be more inclined to go for a versatile winger that they believe can play on both sides. And as I said earlier, I think Crescencio Somerville falls into that category. With Nico Williams, the challenge is that the overall cost is really high. You've got a release clause in excess of 45 million. You've got taxes on top, which mean 45 million pounds plus taxes might be something more like 55 million. And then you've got the wage, and he's already on 200,000 euros a week at Athletic. And my understanding is it would take more like £200,000 a week to make that deal happen. And I just don't think that that's the kind of deal that Newcastle would proceed with. And the same, by the way, can be said for Chelsea as well. Before they entered the race for Michael Olise, they'd already ruled out Nico Williams. And even though we've seen fresh links since, because he's done fantastic at Euro 2024, my understanding remains that Chelsea are also not in the race for Nico Williams. And I think that is the same, to my knowledge anyway, for Newcastle United. They may well like the player, but they don't like the package.
Okay, Chiesa is another linked name. What do you think about him? Obviously linked last year with Newcastle in the last summer window.
Yeah, we seem to constantly have these links between Newcastle and Chiesa. And historically, there's not really been any substance in them, to be perfectly honest with you. But it's the first chance that I think realistically Chiesa has to leave Juventus, because maybe a year ago, Juventus' position was stronger, but now he's into the final year of his contract. And my understanding is that it's Roma or Napoli who are the most likely destinations. I would also keep an eye on Galatasaray and Al Ahly as well, who can't be discounted. And Chiesa's agent has already been holding meetings with both Juventus to explain the player's perspective, and also is engaged with suitors at the moment. There's no club-to-club negotiation, but what there is talks between clubs and Chiesa's agent. So an exit's not yet guaranteed, but I think Juventus will sanction one if an offer arrives in excess of 25 million. So let's wait and see whether Newcastle finally make those rumours something a bit more concrete, because there was never a realistic possibility of Newcastle entering the race 12 months ago or wherever these rumours first started. And even now, I'm not aware of Newcastle progressing on that front. But I do think at 25 million, good value there. So it wouldn't surprise me if a Premier League club enters the race. But I think Roma and Napoli are the two main ones at this stage to keep an eye on.
And Mbeumo is a name that's been mentioned in the chat by a few people as well. Any rumours on Mbeumo, says Mark?
Yeah, I think Newcastle do like him. Mbeumo, there's a little bit more substance to this one, but it will all just depend on Brentford at this point. And it doesn't appear that Brentford financially are in the same boat as many other clubs. So they're in no position where they have to sell. I know that Tottenham have also looked as well. So this is the kind of deal that will progress after the financial deadline. If Newcastle are to sign a player like that, it's likely to be a 40, 50, maybe even 60 all-in kind of deal. It depends how inflated the market get and what the demand is. So one to watch in July potentially for Newcastle. There's more legs to that one than Chiesa. But again, at the time we're recording, I know I sound like a broken record on this front, but it's just the reality that Newcastle are looking for money in, not to spend money out. So there's nothing advanced and there's no club-to-club negotiation taking place, but there's several Premier League suitors that feel there might be a window of opportunity there.
Simply rumours at the moment. Barry, who is in the chat tonight, does the list for us. I sent it over to you for a bit of a look through. I'm sure I said we're going to update you every week with Barry's list, but I think it was at 122 players, which is crazy. But Stu Penman always looks on the bright side. He says, yeah, but if you get a quote, if you we'll sign 3 or 4 of those names potentially. So, and there's some good names on that list. So that's probably a positive way of looking at it. Steve says Ferguson at Brighton would be a positive. Is he affordable? Is Ferguson potentially going to move, do you think, from Brighton?
You know what? I think a year ago I'd have said yes. Chelsea, Manchester United were the 2 most likely destinations. Now I'm not so sure because he didn't have the best season last campaign. And the valuation of Brighton hasn't changed because they still feel there's demand. And in addition to that, the market is inflated and Brighton are experts in getting the price that they want. So the short answer to affordable is no. The longer answer is maybe a year ago, Brighton would have said in this market, he's 100 million. Now I think you'd be lucky to find a suitor that would put down 75 million for Evan Ferguson. And Newcastle just don't have that kind of money. So the bad news with these kind of names for Newcastle is that they would be reactionary targets if Isak shocked us and departed. And then you've got 100 million in, or maybe more. And I come back to what I said before, and I'll reiterate this because it was on other shows where we went into a bit more detail. And Newcastle do not need 100 million, 115 million to be comfortable within PSR. They need 30 to, at the top end, 50 million. That's my understanding pretty consistently, and I think is now widely reported. So in that context, if they brought in an Isak fee, they would likely have 50 million or potentially 70 million to invest. And, the other thing in all of this is don't just look at numbers, look at the net spend, because that's the key thing in all of this. So if Isak went, you create a big enough budget within the net spend you're prepared to have to go in that direction. But because they don't want to lose Isak, they're not talking about these names yet. They're not lining anything up. It's a long window. So Ferguson is not on Newcastle's radar. It's not going to be affordable. It's not going to be possible. If a big name leaves and it's Isak and they strengthen in that position, then let's wait and see. But there's nothing I'm aware of at the moment. Okay,
we've got about 5 minutes left. If you've got any more players that you want to ask a question to Ben about, get them in now. I'll try and find a couple of questions which won't take up that 5 minutes. Tom, this question for Ben: how far will England get in the Euros, and who do you think will win the tournament after watching the first week and a half?
Yeah, disappointed with England, although very impressed with the little cameo from Anthony Gordon, Cole Palmer and Kobbie Mainoo. So maybe in the round of 16, things will change. I love that people say England are on the easy, in inverted commas, side of the draw. Well, guess what? First of all, from that harder side, you've got to play the team in the final if you get that far. But it's not exactly an easy draw because it's likely to be the Netherlands and then it's likely to be Italy. So for me, that's tough. And I think that the Netherlands have been as hit and miss as England, and Italy have just got a knack of beating England. So my hopes are low for England. I stand by what I said at the beginning of the tournament, that France will win it. I thought England would go far. Now I'm not so sure. They've lacked balance. They've lacked fluidity. And the Trent Alexander-Arnold in midfield hasn't really worked. I think that it's no disrespect to him, because we know he's right-sided, but Trippier on the left side has been problematic. And it means that he defensively and leadership-wise still offers something, but doesn't get the best overlapping out of Phil Foden, which means that he's been in a wide area and then Bellingham's given the freedom through the centre, and that restricts Foden as well. So something needs to change. I think the best front six in the tournament haven't been the best front six in the tournament. And unless they get going, England are not going to get past the quarterfinals. But I think France will win it. They've not been great either. They've not had a French player score in open play. They've only had an own goal and a penalty. But the difference is that England, if they're to go far, need that momentum. And if they don't have it, they'll get found out by a more serious opposition. Whereas France, they're always nonchalant. They're always slow starters. They're not going to be panicking that they're not playing that well and they're not scoring. France are going to get better with every game. Whereas I sort of fear England might get worse with every game as the opposition gets harder. And this is why, unfortunately, I no longer think England are going to win it. But I'm happy to say that and be pessimistic and have low expectations and then be proven wrong.
Yeah, Michael, it's a good one. He says, how's yours Ben on Newcastle's budget July onwards? If he's well off the mark, will he grow out in style and get a perm as a forfeit?
Yeah, I don't really think that I can go quite permy. It won't grow long enough anymore. I'm getting old. It's not going to grow that long, unfortunately. But hey, why not? On the sort of bet thing, by the way, because you mentioned it at the beginning. It's not that I don't take these bets. It's just that as a journalist, I don't see them as responsible to start saying, well, I reported this about finances with Newcastle and now I'm going to place a bet on the credibility of my reporting or just on Newcastle's finances, because it's just not responsible as a journalist. So it's not that I won't have a bit of fun, Stu, for charity, and it's not that I won't put down 1,000 for charity, but we got to do something fun, like who will finish higher, Newcastle or Leicester. I would never attach a bet to my reporting being right or wrong, and I would never attach a bet to anything relating to a club or their finances, because I just don't think it's in keeping with editorial standards. But I'll grow a perm if I can, or I'll have a bit of fun for charity on Leicester versus Newcastle. I just don't want to get sucked into something factual around reporting and tying it to something, whether it's right or wrong, because I don't think that's fair to Newcastle, their finances, or the editorial integrity of how a journalist should report their information.
I'm going to ask two more questions before we finish. Craig Lee, question. It was reported months back that Newcastle had sold a share which put 30 million into the club to sort PSR issues. What happened?
Yeah, I don't really know about the moving around money. They've been quite cryptic, so I can't really add much on that. We'll see the accounts and we'll see how money's been moved around for 23-24. So at this point, there's not really anything that I can add on that, unfortunately.
Okay, and the question from Ali B, this was a good one. Is there any news or rumours on the City case outcome? I think a lot of people felt that the sudden surge in transfer stories over the weekend was because maybe, in journalistic circles, people had maybe heard a rumour that City didn't win, their legal case, meaning that, that things weren't going to change. And that's why we might have seen a sudden splurge. I was thinking it was probably more to do with the fact that we're heading towards, the end of this month when people have to put their money in, if they're short.
God, what a question to bring with 90 seconds remaining.
I know.
Manchester City legal case. The situation is that later this year, around autumn, we expect the independent panel to rule. Manchester City have their own case, which might benefit Newcastle, which is challenging associated party transaction rules. And what they're basically saying is a bit like Newcastle said during the long-running takeover. You may have rules as a league, but there's wider European law. And Manchester City believe that the Premier League's rules on associated party transactions, regardless of the fact that the clubs voted for them with a 2/3 majority, are anti-competitive. And Man City believe that they can go outside of football and the Premier League to get a ruling stating there is anti-competition. Now, if they get that, then the manner in which they've done some of these deals and moved their money around in reference to the 115 charges may be looked at in a different light. And that may give Manchester City an advantage with some of the charges. But there's 115 of them. And they're all in different areas. And they've all got a different history. And some of them have been heard in UEFA. They were found guilty. They overturned it in the Court of Arbitration for Sport. Some are eligible to be heard by the Premier League and weren't by UEFA because there's different periods, and in UEFA some are time barred and in England some are not. So it's complicated. And I think the only thing I can say, because we're overrunning, is don't look at autumn as final, because whatever happens, there'll be another appeal, there'll be another challenge, and therefore we're not going to get a full resolution on Manchester City immediately. But if there is a significant points deduction or stripping of titles, or in a very worst case scenario, expulsion, these punishments are supposed to happen immediately. I think with expulsion, it would be different because you'd have to wait for the appeal. But as we've seen with Forest and Everton, if there's a significant points deduction, it's immediate. And then only if you win your appeal is it restored. So that may move things along quicker. But if the Premier League are unsuccessful, I expect them to appeal. If Manchester City are unsuccessful and they're found guilty, I expect them to appeal. So I don't think we're actually going to learn that much, even if we see a bit more information in 2024. My sense is this may drag on years because it's so complex and there's so many charges. And the other thing to note with Manchester City, which we have to as journalists, even though people always attack us for it, is Manchester City are vociferous. They're adamant in their innocence. And it is an innocent until proven guilty process and system. So in talking about the punishments and the severity, we should also point that out, that City have hired some of the best lawyers on the planet to prove that they're innocent. And I think Newcastle are a bit torn in all of this because, as I said before, some of the City arguments regarding how they've moved their money around and some of the commercial deals they've done are the kind of deals that Newcastle want to do. And if Man City are successful in proving the Premier League's rules, even though they were voted for third-party or associated party transactions are anti-competitive, Newcastle will be celebrating that, and it will put Newcastle in a stronger position. But of course, at the same time, many Newcastle fans are looking at many of the other charges and saying they think Manchester City need to be made an example of, even though Manchester City say that they're innocent. So some aspects of this may actually have a positive knock-on effect for Newcastle if Man City succeed, and other ones obviously may be ones that Newcastle feel benefit them because any advantages Manchester City have gained if they're found guilty put the Premier League clubs on a level playing field, and that may benefit Newcastle as well. But we're going to have to be patient from this one. And there you go. That's a 4-minute answer, but I think that was quite succinct given that the topic was very complex. The other thing before we go, Steve, if we've got time, is we should be talking about Max Kilman and Newcastle as well before we finish.
Okay, yeah, go on. Give us an insight on that, because that's another one that's been linked. Obviously, Elliot Anderson potentially going the other way as well, Ben.
Yeah, Elliot Anderson wants to stay at Newcastle. I think that's pretty clear from talking to sources. So I think he'd be reticent in being spoken about as part of a deal. If he did go, then I think it's very unlikely that Newcastle would entertain offers for Bruno Guimaraes, even if they came in at the 80, 90, 100 million mark, because you have a situation where they'd be losing a midfielder for a defender. And then if Bruno goes as well, you leave a hole. Whereas if only one midfielder goes, you've got Tonali coming back, you've got Lewis Miley, Joe Linton can play there, you've got Bruno Guimaraes, you've got Sean Longstaff. There's plenty of midfielders, right? But imagine if Bruno went and Elliot Anderson went in a swap deal or whatever you want to call it, 2 separate deals, then you're a bit short in midfield. So even if that gets you Kilman, if Guimaraes went, you need another midfielder. The favourites are West Ham, if a deal is done. The valuation is 45 million, and Wolves would sell at that number, according to my information, even though they're not desperate to lose their captain. But if it hits 45 million in straight cash, they'll sell. And the last bit of information that I learned in the last few hours is that there's been no second West Ham bid, according to my information. I fully respect those that have said otherwise, but there's been no second West Ham bid, according to my information. The first one that was rejected was around the 25 million mark and was well below Wolves' valuation. Napoli have already had a bid turned down for 30 million. So you know it's got to be above that number as well. And as things stand, West Ham are expected to make a second bid. I don't yet know if Newcastle will return, but their interest is concrete. I think even in January and last summer, we spoke about Newcastle and Kilman, and now we're seeing that manifest in practice. So there still could be an opportunity for Newcastle, maybe Manchester United as well, if West Ham don't return. But I think that Kilman himself would like to play under Julian Lopetegui if Wolves feel that a deal suits all parties. So one to watch, but at the moment, I don't see any possibility of Elliot Anderson going. And I think Newcastle would have to find 45 million in straight cash if they're seriously to enter the race.
Great stuff, Ben. As always, unbelievable figures tonight. A record for NUFC Matters. 4,600 people watching live tonight across Facebook, LinkedIn, and X, as well as YouTube. If you haven't found us before, get onto YouTube, hit the subscribe button by searching NUFC Matters. And if you're interested in Ben, he always speaks a lot of sense. Follow him on X. You can find him at Ben Jacobs. Ben, as always, be great to get you back on, hopefully next week, and we'll keep in touch. Take care, mate.
All the best. Have a good evening, everyone.